I start with the premise that you can break any subject, the situational analysis of the company, the how to raise cash for $100 million to build the company growth, whatever the subject may be, that you could break the subject into 10 or fewer greatest thoughts. The original reaction is no way. It's much more complicated than that. And that's the point. It doesn't have to be that complicated. And if you force yourself to really think the greatest thoughts on a topic, boy, you're way ahead on the process of thinking smartly and then making better decisions.
So many people, not just in senior leadership roles, but even in your own life, you find yourself stuck in what you're referring to as analysis paralysis. And that can be even a non-work related decision. And yet you can't help that because we've been taught to be analytic. We've been taught to weigh the facts, look at the numbers, to do some research. How do you get out of that? How do you make faster, more confident decisions and hopefully better decisions?
So I think the most simplistic answer is you need a structured, organized way to think about any topic. And that structured, more methodical way in the book is called MegaCepts. And MegaCepts from Greek is basically what are the greatest thoughts on any given topic. And the topic can be as complex as peace in the Middle East. It can be as homebound as how do I become a better mother to my teenage kids. It can be somewhere in a career of, how do I make a career change from non-tech into tech. It can be any topic. And any topic can be broken down into 10 or fewer MegaCepts or greatest thoughts. And if you use the process in the book to do that, it's a 4-step process, then having those greatest thoughts in front of you allows you to make better decisions. So since I don't have author authority from 5 prior successful books, but I have a lot of practical experience at teaching this, I spent some time thinking about how could I convince people that basic thesis of the book, any subject can be broken down into 10 or fewer MegaCepts or greatest thoughts. How do I convince them that it has validity? And so my grandson, who's a PhD in biology, was my director of research. And I said, let's take the 8 major religions of the world, the 7 major forms of government, and the 3 major branches of science, and go research and find if they each had 10 or fewer MegaCepts or greatest thoughts about them. Lo and behold, he came back in a month with every one of those had that. Every one of those had captured the essence of what it was. So, I mean, taking 2 simple examples, Christianity, you can read a Bible that has 2,000 pages. You can read 1,000 books about Christianity. But if you just focus on the 10 commandments and not only read them, but study them and understand what they mean in the context of being a Christian, then, or Jewish, both, then you will have a framework, the MegaCepts, the greatest thoughts about Christianity in front of you. In the case of a government example, a democratic republic, if you take the U.S. Constitution and just take the original 10 Bill of Rights, and they're debated every day of our lives, if you take those 10, you understand the essence of what a democratic republic is all about. So in the book, those are developed, and in the appendix, there's even more development of each one of those across those 8, 7, and 3 areas, so that I try to convince people, if you don't believe me, that you can break a topic down into 10 or fewer, then believe the experts. And if you're a CEO client of mine 10 years ago, and I start with you and say, I'd like you to teach you a process to think smarter, and I start with the premise that you can break any subject, the situational analysis of the company, the how to raise cash for $100 million to build the company growth, whatever the subject may be, that you could break the subject into 10 or fewer greatest thoughts. The original reaction is no way. It's much more complicated than that. And that's the point. It doesn't have to be that complicated. And if you force yourself to really think the greatest thoughts on a topic, boy, you're way ahead on the process of thinking smartly and then making better decisions. So as simple and stupid as that sounds, it's so strong. It's so strong in terms of validity. And again, I'm not the expert. Those that came up with the other, religions and governments and branches of science are smart. So that's a thesis.
Right.
And I try to say, believe the thesis until you prove me wrong, because I know it works, because I've done it many, many times on many different subjects. And so one of the things that the book does that I think makes it come alive, and it's kind of what the 1 Minute Manager did for management, and that is there are 6 very different examples of real people that I asked to use the process, 4-step process, to find the greatest thoughts on a subject. And they all did it, and it shows the steps, and the subjects range from being the best parent to a teenager to finding the best college major for your career, to building better interpersonal skills, to building better leadership skills, to understanding AI, to figuring out what's going on in healthcare with relating to patient deaths. Very different subjects, but the process is the same. And what comes out the other side of the 4 steps are the greatest thoughts. And so a lot of people that have read the book say that brings the point home most graphically, because if the mother is reading the book and she reads this woman who took the process and turned it into, these are my believed 10 or fewer greatest thoughts on becoming a better mother to my teenage kids, it makes it come alive. And by the way, that was my experience with these CEOs and other leaders, board members, and so on that I worked with as a coach. Once they saw it and used it, it became real. It became believable and powerful.
So how does somebody, let's say you're running a business and you're trying to make a decision on something. How then, if you could walk us through one of these business examples, how would someone go about finding the 10 greatest thoughts, or what you might say, the principles or whatever, on that particular area? How would they approach that?
So yeah, I use all my background in business is technology,
Okay.
semiconductor, computer, software, and so all my clients, all of my people that I act as a coach to, including their boards and their leadership teams, were in tech, and so that came up very early. And I said, let's take a model for computing that has lasted for 75 years, since the 40s, and is still valid today, even on things like AI. And that model, it's the only diagram in the book, because I try to keep it simple, is the basic computer model is you have a box, and on the left side you have input, and in the middle you have processing, and on the right side you have output, and at the bottom you have storage. And so if you take that as the brain and how to think, the way the computer thinks is it's programmed in processing to methodically think about what the input is, analyze it, go through the program steps to say what's coming in. In AI, it gets more complex than that. And then the output becomes thinking about the input sufficiently to come up with the greatest thoughts. So that's a simplistic model. But if you take that model and if you went back to, let's say, 20 of my CEOs and said, what do they do in thinking now? A lot of them take input. In fact, they want infinite input. They want the staff and the research people and consultants, they want infinite fire hose input. And then they try to decipher from the input what the output should be. And very often they do very little processing. This is going to go off branch a little bit, but my freshman year, I was taking Physics 101, and I'd gotten all A's in high school in all my classes, including physics and math and science. And the hardest school course at Princeton is Physics 101, and it was taught in the same lecture hall as Einstein practiced. And each week after taking the lectures, you take a quiz on Friday, and it was a 40-point quiz, 4 problems, 10 points each. And that Saturday morning, they would publish the results of the quizzes of the 150, 200 people in the class. And I went, after my first week, I was on my way to football practice, and went by, and I started looking on the upper left and on the computer printouts, and there were a bunch of 40s, and they got down to about 32, and then 32 to 25, and 25 down to 16. I had gotten 5. And so I went to football practice, and I thank God I had to, sweat and worry about other things than that, because I thought my whole life had gone before me, because I straight A's in high school. And so I went back on the way back from football practice to my dorm. This is literally my freshman year in the first week at Princeton. And I said, I'm going to look back and see who got a 40. And there were 5 that got perfect grades. And one was in my dorm. His name was Jim. And I went to Jim and I said, Jim, can you tell me how you did it? He said, well, go get your workbook. And I went back to my dorm room and I got my workbook, and I very proudly opened it, because I had, from the prior lecture, 7 pages of detailed notes.
Wow.
All written down. And he said, Dave, I think I understand the problem. Here's my notebook. And he had half a page. So all I was doing in the computer model was taking all of the input from the lectures and copying it,
Right,
and storing it in my notebook, and then reading it back. And then when the quiz came, all I had was a bunch of data. I didn't have any thinking about it. And what he was doing was he was taking the same input, was thinking about it, and said, that's an important point. That's a MegaCept. That's a greatest thought on this lecture. So, I mean, that sounds like a stupid story. It was so meaningful in my life, and I adopted his approach, and I ended up, after 4 years, graduating with kind of a B plus, A minus. So that changed my whole approach to how you think, i.e., don't just suck in data and pour it out again. Actually process it. So if I take that model and that story, which I use many times with the CEOs, they do a lot. They don't do enough processing, and some of it's ego. I don't have to. I've been there, done that. Some of it's dictatorial. I don't deal with that stuff. I already know what to do. Some of it's psychological. If I do that, if I process, then I'm going to end up, not looking decisive. It's very psychologically complex why they don't think enough. And so what I found is, if you give them that simple model, the computer model, and you give them this kind of 4-step process to how you determine the 4 greatest, the 10 or fewer greatest thoughts on any topic, they fall in love with it. And the interesting thing, the first thing you should do as a leader to think about something is not get a whole bunch of input, because you've already, over your career on a subject, how to raise $100 million in cash, you have all kinds of inputs already stored. And all you need to do is write down and think through, what are my greatest thoughts on raising the 100 million, or preventing bankruptcy, or growing at 20% compounded. And it's amazing if you do that first, rather than getting all of this disparate input from staff and so on. You have a framework to start with, and then you go to the next steps, which is get more input and so on. I'm sorry for being so verbose, but it is incredibly uplifting to realize how a simple process and a simple model like the computer model can make people think smarter.
I think it's really interesting what you've been talking about because I think there's two different key points that I'm taking away from this, and correct me if I'm wrong or if I've missed something. However, it seems that you're talking about the importance of not just gathering more data for the sake of more data, which is something I think a lot of us are overwhelmed with in a day and age when we can have access to a lot more data than we maybe had prior to all the various technologies that we're using now. And then at the same point, to be able to narrow the focus. So perhaps you can talk a little bit about how you would determine those four, or what you're saying at those key, what you're saying are sort of the pillars, or the principles, for example, when you're making a decision. You're saying take what you already know, right, and determine what are the key principles. How do you do that?
Well, I think if you go to the steps, they're pretty simple. The first is before you collect a whole bunch of other inputs on a subject, you already have enough here. If you're a CEO of a company in tech, you already got a lot up here, both from your own company, career experience, and from reading stuff and so on. So force yourself to write down formally in simple MegaCepts, simple greatest thoughts, what your going in thinking is before it gets contaminated with all the other inputs. The second step is to then decide who in your audience, in your group, in your team, in your family, whatever it is, would be the most meaningful 2 or 3 additional inputs. And before you misguide them with what your thoughts are going in, you say, what are your thoughts? Pure, just pure. Write down your MegaCepts on the same topic. And then you take those 2 or 3 new ones and you synthesize those with yours, and you come up with the next step. And the next step is you actually do some guided research. One of the blessings of the internet, one of the blessings of AI is you can refine what you're searching for very, very closely. So the third step is to simply do some very, very directed research and then further refine your MegaCepts on the topic. And then finally, with all that done, you take a breather and you think through the process and you say, here are my final initial MegaCepts or greatest thoughts on the topic of raising $100 million. So the process, it's so simple, it's stupid, but I believe simplicity properly done in anything in life is powerful. It's like saying, give us the theory of relativity. Well, that's really complex. Well, it's called E equals MC squared.
Right.
It's pretty simple. Give me how to be a spiritual person. Well, how about the golden rule? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Simple, powerful. And so this process is very simple, but it ends up being powerful because it's structured in a way that says you can't end up with 50 greatest thoughts. You want to have 1 to 10. And you are doing it through a synthesis of your own brain and your own thinking, independent of anything else. And then you're filling in with more. And one of the beauties of coming out with the final MegaCepts on raising $100 million, let's say, is it's now captured and it's been through a process that involves participative leadership. You're participatively leading this process yourself to get to a conclusion. And so you're not only building the greatest thoughts that you can then use to make your decisions with, but you're also building an audit trail to say, it's probably not perfect, but we captured it and we're going to do it. And then if a year later you go back and say, let's see what else we should change. The audit trail of thinking is an important thing because, believe it or not, even very smart people make the decision. And then a year later, they've lost exactly the framework with which they made the decision. And again, that sounds stupid. How can bright people be that way? But they are.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting that you sort of take, in a sense, what sounds to me, maybe back in the day when I was learning math and science, was to be able to look back your work, right? Because everything was handwritten. How did you solve the problem? And then if you came up with the wrong answer, the teacher or the professor would look at that whole formula with you. Do you know what I mean? Look at step by step,
Yes.
and you'd see where you got it wrong, as opposed to just saying you got the wrong answer. The idea was, and maybe it was easier in the old days when things were written out, right? Nowadays, everything is done on a calculator, on a computer, so you don't necessarily have all those steps laid out. But to be able to look back your thinking and understand where the train sort of jumped the tracks, I think that's a very interesting discipline that I actually never have heard anybody else use that in context of decision making.
It's essential. And with all the visibility of all the election stuff in the US, um, I've spent a lot of time talking to people that I know in government and about how the government process works from a leadership standpoint. And you would be appalled at the lack of new thinking that takes place in any sort of organized, structured way. It's mostly just following opinions and policies and other stuff. And so one of the new books I'm going to write, if this succeeds to any level, is going to be I'm going to have a mega thinking series. And the first book is Mega Thinking to Become a Better Leader, and about thinking to become a better leader. And then I'm going to have mega thinking on peace in the Middle East or government leadership or something like that. So again, this idea that things have to be so complex to be powerful
Right.
it's just wrong. It's just wrong. And if you break it down to get more simplicity, it's kind of like what the One Minute Manager did with their three secrets of management, which were about as simple as you get, but they were under. By the way, one of the things that the book does, and that is helped by hundreds, literally thousands of famous wise men, philosophers, leaders over the centuries, is thinking probably has more powerful quotes about it than any other topic. Maybe love has more, maybe religion has more, but thinking has been a preoccupation for the millennia by intelligent people. And one of the reasons is thinking is, if you really think about it, the most powerful thing you can do as a human being. Subconscious thinking is the only reason we're alive. If our brain wasn't working subconsciously, we'd be dead. I mean, then simple thinking like getting dressed and going shopping and normal stuff, the brain's so powerful, it just takes care of it. More complex thinking, like the subjects we've been talking about, like running a company, people are afraid to think on those things. That they avoid it. It's it sounds too complicated to think about it. So if you can break it down like the book tries to do, and say it's easy. The reason I took those six people and had them actually apply the process is the first one I put in there was a mother who's having major problems being the mother to her two teenage kids, and she used the process, and I couldn't put her real name in there, but doing the process, she now has her final MegaCepts, which were 9, the greatest thoughts on being a better mother to teenagers, plastered everywhere. She has it on her iPhone. She has it in her computer. She has it in the mirror in her bathroom. She has one on each of the kids' walls. So getting back to your point of capturing it and not only living it, but having it formalized for everybody that's involved is pretty powerful. She's had monumental improvement just by doing what I said.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think what's particularly important is you focus on simplicity, and it seems to me, and I'd be curious to see, to hear how you see this, that we entered sort of into an age where we put higher value on complexity. Maybe an age that's driven more by consultants who come in and have present a very complex model of things, very detailed charts and graphs and analysis of things that perhaps are, you know, expand and get bigger and more complicated. And it seems that that's been considered to be, oh, that must be more, that they must be right. It's more valuable. That's better insights or something. And when something's presented as something very simple, it's like, oh, that's just, a very simplistic way to look at it. So not important, not valuable, maybe missing some things. What's your take on that?
I think you're right on. I think massive consulting firms like Boston Consulting Group and McKinsey and many others have made a living off of complexity. And here you are, CEO of Exxon or wherever, and you're a massive company and you're a high level person and you got a whole staff and all kinds of intelligent people, and you contract with McKinsey to do a $10 million study of your situation and what to do about it. Those people thrived on complexity and the ability to say we can come up with ways to think about the complexity that perhaps you can't. And I think some of the things they did in their processes were actually valuable. One of the greatest ways to think about your situation is to do a SWOT analysis. I mean, that's pretty simple.
Right,
Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats.
right.
And I don't know who invented that, probably McKinsey, but they come in and say, all right, now let's take this very complex environment and actually break it down with a very simple process, SWOT. So I'm agreeing with you, and I also think that complexity becomes almost an excuse for some leaders to say, I don't know what to do. And you go into the board meeting and you basically say, what do you guys think? And it's almost an excuse, the complexity. Right. And it does not have to be that. I think we're living through that in the Middle East. Just to take a very macro thing, if you really got the most intelligent people together to come up with the greatest thoughts on how do you break down the complexity of the religious persecution and hate and all that sort of stuff, and how do you break it down into a concrete set of greatest thoughts on that subject, and what do you do about each, and take that level of simplicity as opposed to the verbose and complex discussions of the history of Islam, and that's interesting, but it doesn't necessarily solve the problem of today. So I'm agreeing with your point, and one of the reasons I liked some of the book models I picked, like Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, and the 1 Minute Manager, is if you really read them, they're very straightforward and clear. If you want to have better interpersonal relationships with other people, here's what you have to do. Step 1, 2, 3. Back in the 30s, when Dale wrote the book, he was already making it simpler, because interpersonal skills, wow, I don't know what that is. Yeah. Well, he broke it down and made it simple, and he sold 40 million copies. 1 Minute Manager did kind of the same thing. So I think there's too much complexity, and I think if you start and think that perhaps simplicity can be powerful. Simple can be powerful. That's a good place to start. And that includes being CEO, saying, what's my situation? Let's take a simple approach to figuring out the situation. And I'm not promoting my book as the first place to do that. There's been many others, but that's certainly one theme in the book. And I purposely, in the first chapter, said, MegaCepts, top 10 greatest thoughts. You got to be kidding me. That's the book? That's the thesis? Give me something a little more substantive. And so that's when I go into some of the examples of E equals MC squared is pretty simple, but it's linked to a pretty powerful concept.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point because they say there's power in simplicity. And as you're pointing out, if you look back historically, that's always been the case, right? The first principles of everything tend to be very simple in terms of how you would define them. And I think that you point to Dale Carnegie's book, you point to Einstein's theories, they always tend to be distilled down to something very simple. And as you add complexity to something, you sort of weigh it down, right? It's almost as when you get let's just say a software program, it does one thing and does it well, which is what I prefer when I'm choosing software versus or other products, or something that does 20 things and doesn't do any of them well, right? It'll do this and it'll do that, it'll do 1,000 different things, and it tends to never really work that well. So I definitely, yeah, I like the fact that you've brought up that we need to get back to defining what are the core principles. And it's easy to understand conceptually. It's difficult oftentimes in the situation to be able to decide which things you're going to keep and which you're going to throw away. So perhaps you can give some guidance on when you're sitting there and it's your situation and everything looks important. How do you decide which ones really are important to be able to get down to those maximum of 10 that you talk about?
So I'm a great believer in business, professional, but also in life. The best way to lead is participatively. And there's a whole bunch of books on participative leadership and what it means and how you do it and that sort of thing. And it is a little more complex to do than, let's say, a autocratic leadership style where you just make the decision. But if you do anything participatively, and that's this little mini process that is used in the book to find the greatest thoughts is a participative process. If you do that running a company, for example, and you have a major decision to make over what are the 10 or fewer greatest thoughts relating to our current situation in business, let's do it over 2 time frames, next year and 5 years. If you participatively fill in that answer, starting the way I described it with you, the leader, thinking through yourself, and then gathering other inputs, you normally end up with a natural fallout of prioritization, because during the discussion with others participatively, you're getting their view of why one thing is more important than another and why one thing should be on the list and shouldn't be on the list. So it sounds overly simplistic, but if you participatively make any decision like that mother relating to her kids as teenagers, and she went out and actually talked to 3 friends after she put her ideas down that she respected and thought were good mothers, and participatively filled in their thoughts. By the time she got to her final MegaCepts as the 4th step, they were pretty prioritized. They were well thought through, but by a participative process. So I think that's the way you kind of naturally prioritize. And if necessary, you end up saying, okay, let's talk about it one more time and put them in order. Sometimes that's worth it, but as long as you keep it to 10 or fewer and not 50, it's almost a natural priority anyway.
Right. Right. So you force yourself basically to say 10 is the maximum, and therefore, if I have 20 things written down on my list, I have to make some tough decisions here.
Some's got to go.
Yeah, exactly.
And again, it forces you to think.
Right.
And
right.
Most people think they're thinking, but many times it's simply taking input and repeating it as output, and that results in 20, not 10, without thinking. And that's back to my notebook at Physics 101. I was so proud I had 7 pages, but all it was regurgitating the input.
Yeah. I mean, I find myself guilty of the same thing. And you want to capture everything when you're listening to a lecture or if you're taking a course. And at the same time, by doing that, you're not really hearing and thinking about what the lecturer or the teacher is actually telling you. You're just so busy writing everything down. And I think that sometimes we're disadvantaged by all the capture technology that we have these days, that maybe in the old days when it was difficult back in, when you didn't have even pen and paper, they had to do more listening, thinking, and discussing. And that probably was a good thing in many ways. Whereas we have the ability to capture probably more data than we really need and to be able to
Sure.
say, get all the notes, keep
Totally. And of course, you're dealing in today's world with so many inputs that are bogus. They're not facts. They're
Mm,
just random opinions. And one of the other topics that I'm thinking about for my second book is there's a whole societal rise, at least in the United States, in truth seeking, because you listen to the news, you read a newspaper, you go online to look at the latest, blurbs. You don't know what to believe, and
true.
there is a process that you can use to properly truth seek, so that when you end up on a subject of, who you're going to vote for president, or do you believe in this bill that's in Congress, or do you believe that there's global warming or not? And instead of listening to opinions and being shaped by the opinions, which are simply the input without you filtering it, and now it becomes your opinion, the output, you're actually thinking. You're actually thinking, truth seeking.
How
And
do you do that?
uh, there's a famous guy, Robbie George, who's a Princeton PhD professor, who's written books, and he's well read and spoken on the topic. And he's focused on universities because that's his background. But he's basically going around and creating a truth-seeking methodology by his writings and his speeches to say, let's say that you're in a room and you're a staunch conservative, and in the other part of the room is a staunch liberal, and you're trying to truth seek on a topic. What should be done about the Middle East? Whatever. If you both listen, think about what the other side is saying, and then you discuss it openly before you say, well, my opinion is X, before you even talk, you attempt to get better truth. And both sides leave not necessarily in perfect agreement, but they leave with a better understanding of the topic than they did coming in, i.e., they have better truth. So he's an example of it, and there's going to be a lot of other educational and leadership skills built around truth seeking, because the world is so driven by misinformation, and you don't know where to believe or not to believe. So you can make any factoid of a statistic say two different things if you want to twist it.
Yeah, that's very true. That's
Jane, I'm sorry to get off subject with you, but I obviously am passionate about the power of thinking, and just what it can mean in your life. And obviously that the book applies to leadership thinking, but it applies to everything in a human's life. People just don't think enough smartly.
yeah. In your opinion, you're talking about the importance of thinking, and I completely agree with you on that. And yet, we're in a day and age when people really prioritize fast, right? Speed. And that seems to be, in some ways, the opposite of thinking. Thinking tends to take a certain amount of time, not necessarily has to be thinking about something forever. But we tend to think of thinking as being something with a timeline. And we're in a day and age when people want you to have an answer immediately, right? In the same way that you put something into a computer, you put something into ChatGPT or whatever, bam, you get something back right away. How do you on an individual basis balance that out?
Well, my experience in playing coach to leaders, once you open their eyes to it, believe in the power of thinking. They've always believed in that, but they've lost how to do it the right way, or they don't do it enough, or they do it in a cursory fashion or whatever. So the minute you open their mind to the importance of thinking, the most important thing in one's life is thinking. There's nothing higher than that, thinking. And by the way, your thinking can be about religion or anything else that's important in your life. So it's not dismissing all other human activities. Once they really think about thinking and how important it is, then they open up and they say, I'm going to think about this, and if it takes me a week, I'm going to take a week. And if the board is pushing me to do it in a day, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. That's the wrong thing to do for the company, or the wrong thing to do. And it takes that kind of a belief that good thinking, smarter thinking is that powerful. One of the things about the book that I found most interesting is going back to these quotes. My grandson researched and found about 1,500 thinking quotes, and we went through the process of boiling them down, and we ended up with 100 in the appendix, but about 30 in the book. And every chapter starts with a quote and ends with a quote, and the quotes reinforce the basics, the importance of thinking and how thinking impacts all aspects of your life. It defines who you are. It educates you. It builds your professional or career activities. It helps with the personal problems. So thinking defines us. What we think, we become. Buddha.
Right.
I think, therefore I am. Descartes.
Right.
And it literally, I thought at one point, I don't have to write a book. All I have to do is organize the quotes and the quotations in the right order, and it tells the story. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but I think if people actually seriously say thinking is that important, and they say it isn't that important, it's the most important thing in my life, then they will take the time to put the proper amount of time into thinking.
Yeah, that's a really important point, because oftentimes people will look for answers on these kinds of, they'll do their research, as you're saying, and then they'll take that research as being the final answer, as opposed to it being just something to provoke you to think further. And certainly people will look to other people for that, but now, as you're saying, there really is what might be described, and correct me if I'm off base, because you probably know more about AI than I do, but an over-reliance on AI to give you a final answer, as opposed to give you just another thing to think about.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I'm on the board of directors of the Computer History Museum, which is by far, by like factor of 100, the largest institution of its type in the world. It captures both the history of computing from the beginning and now captures all the new stuff like AI that's going on. And if you ever come to Silicon Valley and have an interest in that, I'll take you on a tour. But the idea that AI is going to take over the world and that sort of thing, we have a whole new exhibit and study in the museum about that, and it's just the opposite. It's going to be even more infinite data and input, but it's going to require even more thoughtful consideration. And one of the ways to think about that is AI is a technology, and AI can do things like ChatGPT, which are powerful. But if you apply it to the various industries that they're talking about AI impacting, and say, what's it going to do there? So they're all talking about education being revolutionized by AI. They're all talking about media being revolutionized by AI. They're talking about healthcare, et cetera, every industry. So I'm an executive chairman of a healthcare company that basically uses technology to take care of patients better by providing best practices for taking care of the patient. And AI is very important in that field. But there's no way in our lifetime AI is going to be intelligent enough to actually make the decisions to do this on this patient this way. What they will be doing is giving the doctor, the nurse, inputs. It's called clinical decision support. So the doctor's still the intelligence applied to the patient, but it has lots of new inputs that didn't have before, from best practices of how to take care of a femur fracture or a brain tumor or whatever the patient's problem is. So you have to be very careful, at least for many, many more decades before AI becomes truly intelligent enough to take over the brain level of intelligence.
Yeah, that's such a good point. There is so much confusion around AI at the moment. I think that you almost don't blame people for some of the perhaps incorrect beliefs they have, simply because the hype cycle has been so fast and furious that unless you have a history of working in this field, all you're getting is what's being put forward more as the wonders of AI and less about the practical applications.
There's a huge fear factor and misinformation factor. And one of the things we did at the museum that I shared was, in addition to capturing history of computing and the technology and some of the stories, we decided that when we wanted what we wanted to be in 5 or 10 years was also the capturing of the entrepreneurial story of companies. And because at the time we did the study, the last 10 years, 15 of the 20 most valuable companies in the world were entrepreneurially created companies. Tesla, Apple, Facebook, you can name them.
Right.
Entrepreneurially created companies. They weren't break off from massive big corporations. And so in doing that, one of the concepts that we came up with and then created what's called at the museum the Expo Center or Exponential Center, because in entrepreneurial companies succeed exponentially, is thought leadership. How do you provide thought leadership to society, not just techies, society, on this amazing set of technologies and where it's going? And AI is our number one focus for doing that, because if you become a thought leader and you intelligently communicate about the facts of AI and where it is today and where it's going to be in the future, then you can remove some of the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that exists in so many people's minds. I mean, a lot of people are just scared.
Yeah, that's very true. There definitely is this sense that AI will take over your job and that we're not going to really have people doing things anymore. And I don't know enough about AI to be able to actually opine on that one way or another. But if you look at previous technologies, and maybe that's not even the right benchmark for it, but previously, that's, any other technology that's come along, automation or computing or anything like that, it tends to take out the inefficiencies, the people who weren't really making any contribution or were, the least valuable players, not always, but generally. But the people who had real talent seem to still be there, right?
I couldn't agree more. One of the things we did in this Expo Center and relating to thought leadership is say, okay, history is much easier to capture and truth seek and report in terms of thought leadership than the future. So what other inflection points have occurred in technology beyond computing itself and some of the things it's done? And the one that is obviously the best hindsight and revolutionary in impact was the internet and websites and online transaction. So you take an industry like retail and you go back and say there's this little company called Amazon that was selling books online and they were laughed at.
Right.
And they dominate the retail world, and they have brought a who's who of major retailers to their knees by leveraging that technology in an entrepreneurial way, and that will happen with AI in various areas. But the smartest people won't be impacted. A good example of that is software. We had the CEO of OpenAI come to the board meeting a couple of meetings ago and report on his view of where AI was going to go. And OpenAI is by far the most visible leading AI technology leader. And he gave his report. It was basically the same thing he did to the U.S. Congress about the ramifications of AI. And at the end, he said, I'm open for questions. And so the first question was, which industries do you think will be most impacted in the next 3 to 5 years by AI? He said, well, I know one that's already basically revolutionized. And he said, that's software. And it's not just software at companies like Oracle and Apple and so on. It's software throughout the whole universe of users and home and consumers and so on, government. And he said the stats are that ChatGPT was designed to write software, and 90% of all programmers right today employed that are just writing code will be gone. But the final 10%, the architects of the software, they will blossom. They'll be even more important.
I think you really shared so many things, and it's interesting to be able to get your perspective on things because so many people, myself included, who are, well, I'm not listening to this, I'm actually doing some of the talking, but for people who are listening to this program, I think that so many people would love to get the insights that you've shared, both on the leadership side of things and decision making. But I think now that you're talking somewhat about AI and how that and the role that that might play, because as you said earlier, you talked about truth seeking. And we're blessed in a sense by having an abundance of information literally at our fingertips. But unfortunately, a lot of that information may or may not be true. Of course, you could say that even before, internet, there were also books that were written that were inaccurate. But I think that there's just an overwhelming amount of things coming at people, and it's very difficult to parse, whether it be as your book talks about decision making, but also just in terms of putting into perspective some of the new things that are coming out, such as AI. It's a lot for even some of the smartest people in the world to be able to, parse all of that and come to some kind of a reasonable conclusion. So I really appreciate your taking the time to share your views on this with us.
My pleasure. And nice to get to meet you. And if you ever get to Silicon Valley, please yell.
Oh, I certainly will.
Oh, you don't have to yell. Just...
Okay. So, well, what I'll do is I'm going to put the links to where people can get this book, obviously on Amazon, in the show notes. I think a lot of people will have an interest in reading this book and being able to dive deeper into what you have to say. I think that so many of us really feel that we're overwhelmed trying to make decisions on so many things across so many different topics that it helps to have a framework like what you've described to be able to put things into perspective.
I couldn't have said it better. You're not only a good speaker, but a good listener.
Well, thank you so much. And Dave, I really appreciate your being with us today. And I would encourage anybody listening to this to take the opportunity and read Dave's book so that you can really get more depth and be able to apply the principles that he's discussed.